Well, last week we started a new series. We're looking at Paul's letter to the Colossian church, and we're titling this series, This is Big. This is Big. And last week we talked about the big change that occurs when we turn to follow Jesus, and today is a big deal. But before we get to that, can I just say that one of the dangers of knowing me is that you might end up in a sermon illustration. Just ask my children, my poor children. Now, don't worry. It's not like I'm going to share like sensitive information. If you share something personal with me, I'm not going to air dirty laundry. I'm not going to air your struggles or things that the rest of the world doesn't need to know. But if you have something I can poke fun of, occasionally Brock resembles that, then I'll go for it. But here's an example of what I mean. I have two friends back in Indianapolis. They're twins, and they're musicians. They've been in metal bands since they were teenagers. And their band, they're really talented musicians. Their band has had the opportunity to open up for major acts that have toured through the Indianapolis area. They've opened for like Def Leppard and Poison and Tesla and on their Facebook page, there's proof of it because there's pictures of them with these other bands. And there's pictures of them with like Jeff Beck and Bret Michaels and Michael Sweet of Stryper, just to make it Christian for a moment. And those photos make sense because, that's the world they live in, rock and roll. They live in that world. But there's also photos of them with people like Peyton Manning and the guy that played the soup Nazi on Seinfeld, right? So they're always on the lookout to get a picture with someone who's a big deal. I've got another friend back in Indiana, Brian. He's another talented musician, an incredible guitar player, but he never wanted the musician's life. He didn't want to travel. He wanted to be a family man. But he's also obsessed with guitar tone. And he used to take apart his guitar pedals to make them sound better. And then he started making his own guitar pedals, and he turned his hobby into to a business. And now he makes high-end boutique guitar pedals that are used by and endorsed by very famous guitar players. He's had endorsements from like Brad Paisley and Keith Urban and Neil Schon from Journey. And so he's had the opportunity to meet and personally know and be known by some very famous musicians. When he first married his wife, though, she didn't know any of these people. She had no idea who any of them were. And if I remember the story right, one time he and his wife were meeting with a very famous guitar player. And not knowing, I don't know if he knew that she was Brian's wife or not, but he kind of came on to her. He was flirting with Brian's wife. And she blew him off. And afterwards, she said to Brian, she said, "Who does that guy think he is?" So he told her. I'm not going to mention his name, but he told her that he's someone who'd played on the biggest stages in the world. He's someone who everyone in this room has heard on the radio. Maybe you've owned some of their albums. He's somebody who's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And her response was, "Big deal." Isn't it funny how we respond to famous people? People who are a big deal for one reason or another. I think I've asked this question before. Who's the most famous person you've ever met? Has anyone ever met someone famous? Yeah.
Big Smoke.
Who?
Big Smoke.
Big Small. Okay.
Smoke.
Big Smoke?
SMO.
See, I don't even know who that is. Okay. Big Smo. All right. I'm sorry. The world is a different place. Right? There's a lot of famous people in different niches, right? Anybody else? Probably the most famous person I've ever met was Ace Frehley, one of the founding members of KISS, the guitar player for KISS. Had a conversation with him once. Rich Mullins, a Christian singer-songwriter, before he died. I got to spend a couple hours in the room with Rich Mullins. Those are my most famous people I guess I've ever met. Maybe you've never met someone famous and you're thinking to yourself, boy, I want to meet someone who's a big deal. Or maybe you're like my friend Brian's wife and says, Big deal. Who cares? Right? But I think the category is different for each of us who is and isn't a big deal. Rock guitarist might not be a big deal for you, but maybe it's a sports legend or a military hero, or maybe it's Joanna Gaines because she can do wonderful things with indoor and outdoor living spaces, and she seems like a really nice person. Maybe you'd love a photo op with financial guru Rupert Murdoch. Maybe it's Vin Diesel. I don't know. But regardless, we probably have someone that we think it would be cool to meet them. It would be cool to get to know them. If we're honest, there's some people that we consider to be a big deal. Somebody I would consider to be a big deal in the Christian world just passed away this week. Timothy Keller, who helped us learn how to navigate in a secular culture and navigate with people that we disagree with in a loving and compassionate and winsome way. But we all have somebody that we see that's a big deal. Maybe you know where I'm going with this. Each and every person here has the opportunity to meet and to know, intimately know the biggest deal of all time. Some people have met him and had their lives changed forever. Other people have overlooked him, saying that he's not a big deal. Other people saw him as a threat. And of course, the biggest deal, the most important person to ever live and breathe is Jesus, the Son of God. And Paul speaks about him here in Colossians 1, starting in verse 15. It says, "The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together." When we think about, he is the image of the invisible God. When we want to know what God looks like, we can look to him. Sometimes when we're reading the Old Testament or we're interpreting the Old Testament, we might wonder if God is always angry, if he's vengeful. But when we interpret who God is and when we wonder what God is like, we see that Jesus gives us the clearest image of who God is. Because Jesus is the image of the invisible God. Jesus walked this earth. He breathed our dust. He sweated under our hot sun. There's an old song. It's in the 90s. It's an old song now. If you want to just feel old, just say the 90s are old. But there's a song called "What If God Were One of Us." Remember that song? What if God were one of us? It's a stranger on the bus. Well, he was. He was. How he lived, how he treated people, how his sacrificial love reveals who God is, because he is God. And it says, in him all things were created. Look around. He's responsible for everything that you see. Your presence here, the air that you breathe, the ground that we stand on, the sun and the sky, all things were created through him and for him. You were created for his pleasure, for a relationship. And he is the one who gives himself for you, for your pleasure, for a relationship, a loving relationship. A relationship with the one who is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He's kind of a big deal. Paul writes on, "And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on a cross." If you're a follower of Jesus, you're part of the body, the church. A lot of people say, I don't want anything to do with church. I'm a Christian. I don't want anything to do. No, if you are a Christian, If you're a follower of Jesus, like it or not, you are part of the body. And Paul, the author of this letter, often refers to the church as a human body, and he says that Jesus is the head of the body, which means that Jesus is the brains of the operation. You might have been worried that it's me. I'm not the brains of the operation. God has called me to be a lead shepherd of this community, but I'm not the brains of the operation. I'm looking to the one who is. We are collectively looking to the one who is. We look to Jesus for clarity, for direction, for wisdom. And this is why we say that it's our goal to keep Jesus central in all we strive to be and do. And that means a Jesus-centered life. That means a Jesus-centered community. That means we are on a Jesus-centered mission when we engage this world. And because it says here that he is the supremacy, God placed all his fullness in Jesus. He's kind of a big deal. Okay, I'm going to sound like a grumpy old guy for a minute, but does this seem like we have a lot of celebrities now that don't do anything? I mean, it's not like some great gift or talent. I'm probably just like a grumpy old guy at this point. But I mean, and I don't mean to lump everybody together, but we now have people who earn a great living as social media influencers. That's all they do, is they're on social media influencing. I don't want to lump them all together. I'm sure there's some variety among who these people are and what they influence, but it just seems to me, in general, they're beautiful people who travel to beautiful places among other beautiful people and get to travel and see beautiful things, experience all the beautiful things that the world has to offer. And I suppose that they gain their following because, hey, who wouldn't want to be a beautiful people and travel to beautiful places? But what do they actually do? I guess they entertain us. But Jesus, okay? What did Jesus do? He reconciled all things to himself. Reconciled all things to himself. He brought peace. And this world lacks peace. I mean, this world is full of anger and hatred and division and violence and murder and you name it. I mean, it lacks peace, anxiety and depression. The world craves peace. And not only is there a lack of peace among us as humans, but there was a lack of peace between us and God. God who is full of love and mercy and unity and peace and healing and life. So Jesus came to bring peace between us and God. And he promises to one day return and bring peace to this earth, removing all the junk that prevents peace. But how did he do this? How did he make peace? Through some great thing? It says by his blood on the cross. I mean, when you think about heroes throughout history, when you think about great people who did great things, I mean, we typically think of someone who did a great thing. They came and did a great thing. You might think of Alexander the Great, who has a word right in his name, great. He was great. He not only conquered foreign lands, he established over 20 cities. He colonized lands that he conquered, spreading Greek culture. We now recognize him as having created the Hellenistic period that lasted well beyond his death through the Roman Empire. He brought common language and culture to the known world at the time. Or maybe you think of Churchill, who would not waver in the face of Nazi aggression. Or maybe you think of Lincoln, who pressed forward during a bloody civil war in order to win freedom for all. Beyond war, I mean, there's scientific discovery and exploration. There are those who led the way to put a man on the moon, to develop the polio vaccine, mapped out human DNA. I mean, when you think of all the great accomplishments throughout human history, think of all the people who are big deals because of the great things that they did. Whether they had the courage, the resolve, the determination to become winners But then there's Jesus who brought about the reconciliation of all things. I mean, the biggest accomplishment in human history, and he did that by losing. By losing. Do you realize that Jesus' losing is greater than all of humanity's winning? He won through losing. His losing made a bigger impact than all our winning combined. He's kind of a big deal. And he desires a relationship with you. A relationship. Well, yeah, he's a big deal. And yes, he's real, but not like real, like in the room real. How often is that the way that we operate and live our life? Yeah, he's real, but not like here and now real. How often do we live in that, with a disconnected view of his reality? I've got a good friend. I really like him and care for him. No one here would know him. He grew up in a toxic church environment, just toxic. I mean, it was just ugly. Super messy, unbiblical examples of what a Christian life is meant to be, and Jesus wasn't well represented there. And he's since abandoned the faith. He's just abandoned it. But he once told me I was the only Christian he could talk to about his doubts. I was the only one who wouldn't shame him, the only one that didn't speak in cliches when he was sharing what was on his mind. And I'm not saying I'm the only one like that, but in his life I was. And one time we were talking, and he said that a relationship with Jesus isn't the same as the relationship between he and I. And he said that's very different. The relationship between he and I is very different than a relationship with Jesus. And I agreed. We were sitting across the table, sharing a meal, having a conversation. He said it's not the same, and I agreed. And for a while, I thought we were on the same page. Then I realized, as we kept talking, I realized we believe that for different reasons. After a while, I realized that he meant that a relationship with Jesus is not as real as a relationship between him and me. It's not as real. But when I agreed that it's not the same, I was coming from a place where a relationship with Jesus is actually more real, more intimate. I mean, Jesus knows me better than any human could ever know me. He knows me better than me. He knows my thoughts and my motivations. He's routinely spoken to me, spoken to my innermost being. And maybe you know what I'm talking about. Moments when you've heard something that spoke to the deepest parts of who you are, the deepest parts of your soul, and you knew it was God speaking to you. I've met a few people who claim they've heard the audible voice of God. But I've heard Jesus in a more profound way. He's spoken to me through his word. He's spoken to me through someone that has said in a church service, spoken through a friend, spoken to me through music, spoken to me when I first looked out at the Rocky Mountains, spoken to me when I met my wife, when I held my children. And when I was praying about whether or not to plant this church, he spoke to me on the banks of the Missouri River. He spoke to me when I discovered my mom lying dead. It's the first time he really, really spoke to me. And made himself real to me. He's spoken to me to the depths of my soul in a way that no friend sitting across the table from me has ever done. Maybe you've experienced that. And maybe you're not sure if it's ever happened to you or not, but maybe deeply you know what I'm saying is true. Jesus the image of the invisible God, God in the flesh, firstborn over all creation, creator of all, before all things, the head of the church, the supreme one. All the fullness of God dwells in him, the one who reconciles all things, who is kind of a big deal, loves us desperately, wants to know us, wants to be in a relationship with us. And Paul writes, once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior, but now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. Once our sins kept us alienated, but our record's been cleared. When we turn to Jesus, our record is cleared. And listen, you know better than anyone that you're not holy by nature. If you don't believe that, take a closer look. I used to think God will accept me because I'm a pretty good guy. I mean, my behavior was not holy, it was sinful, but come on, I'm a pretty good guy. But I was alienated from God because of my sin. But Jesus reconciled me to God through his physical body. And this was not something I deserved. None of us do deserve it. It's a gift of grace received by faith. It means I don't earn it. It's received by faith. I don't have to be good enough to claim it. I just have to turn to him in faith. But speaking of faith, Paul writes this: if you continue in your faith. If you continue in your faith. There's an uncomfortable if in that sentence. If you continue in your faith, established and firm, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel. This is the gospel that you heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant. As we come to an end here, let's look for a moment at faith. It says that we've been reconciled and are made holy in his sight if you continue in your faith. And I think sometimes we think of faith as like this mental acknowledgement, right? That we have at a moment. A mental acknowledgement. It's like, do you believe it? Yep, I believe it. I'm right there with it. I believe that. Check. But what is faith and what does it do? What is faith and what does it do? Well, what it does is what we talked about last week. It changes our citizenship. It makes us citizens of God's kingdom. And as today we're looking at it, it reconciles us in a relationship with God. Those are the results of our faith. And here Paul is saying that when we have those things, citizenship in God's kingdom where Jesus is king. We're reconciled in a relationship with God because of Jesus. And the doorway to those benefits is faith. And Paul is saying we need to continue in that faith. We need to continue in it. Established and firm. And he warns us not to move from the hope that is held out to us, offered to us in the good news about Jesus. So what is faith? The best definition I've ever heard comes from A.W. Tozer, who wrote that faith is the gaze of the soul upon a loving God. Faith is the gaze of the human soul upon a loving God. It's when we realize I'm not capable, I am not good enough. I need to look to God to make me so. And when we live a life of faith, it means that we live a life where we are looking. Our soul is looking, gazing upon God, a loving God. It's when our soul looks to Jesus, the perfect image of who God is. It's when we look to Jesus, the supreme creator of all. When we look to Jesus, the head of the church, Jesus who reconciles. And this gazing upon him is not a one-time thing, and not a one-time acknowledgement. It's an ongoing relationship that we were created for with the creator of the universe, Jesus, who is a very big deal.